Welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to continue talking about mediums in art. One today that we're going to mention, or I'm going to mention, has some different components to it, is a little bit confusing, but nevertheless is readily available in our lives still. And that's going to be printmaking. Potentially you've used printmaking before in your maybe in your public education that's doing something where you're carving away a block and putting ink on the surface, and or maybe even in elementary school it goes as far as building up relief textures. I remember I once had to glue beans to a surface of a plate to build up a layer, and then that was then inked and pressed down. So there's a lot of different ways that this application can be done, from a very craft base to a very controlled and technological base. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to sort of break down the basic principles and guidelines of this. So this is truly the art of making many, right, or multiples. Now the advantage for artists to making multiple is that, yeah, you have now more that can be sold. So printmaking historically started out as an advantage for those artists who needed a different sort of market, right? Like you're not going to charge as much because you have many prints, but you can now reach a different demographic. It's not just for upper class patrons. It's not just for the wealthy. It can be for the everyday. We know of Gutenberg in the 1450s and his invention of the movable type and the printing press, which allowed, the idea of copying text a whole lot quicker instead of handwriting them. But that same printing press has been used and even modified to service other mediums and techniques that still base off of the principles of making many. Now, in China, this actually did start earlier than even the 1450s, and there's even been a more recent discovery where they think that some of the first real movable type was from Korea, and so Gutenberg was really the one historically that we have a lot of information about that's put all together, but we found traces of it back in the East. So of course paper is a big necessity, and so it would make sense that China has probably had the use of this for some time, and we know that they had used it for textiles and advertising. You can think of the idea of just stamping, right? This is the same thing as printmaking. It's not that you have to have a printing press to be a printer. So that's kind of one of those misnomers. And I use the YouTube link there to talk a little bit more about the generic aspect of printmaking and how it breaks down. It's a really nice little film about engraving, and we'll give you sort of the basics of all of these techniques. But there are 5 real printing technique methods that everything dwindles down to. And so we are going to talk about relief. We're going to talk about intaglio, lithography, screen printing, and newer digital prints. Okay, so relief. As the image of the process there shows, right, it's the idea of carving away. This is the oldest, the most common, the most rudimentary, but it's still used today. It's never been replaced, and its effect has never been sort of outdated. I myself have my master's studies are all in printmaking, so this is what I even still use to this day. What's really nice about it is that it can come from a variety of materials. It can be carved out of wood. More contemporary mediums are linoleum. But anytime you're removing material from a surface, it's going to be categorized as a relief print. Okay, so anything that leaves a raised surface for that ink roller, right, when we take that like rolling pin of ink and spread it across the surface, right? It's whatever's at the top is what's going to receive that ink, be it black or any color. Okay, so that's relief printing. Some sort of examples of the process, right? There's multiple ways that you can create relief blocks. So I just kind of quickly pulled some images here to sort of give you an idea of what's going on. Really quickly, like here's the block itself. and it's all carved away. And then of course here it is printed. So of course the O and the O have to match here, because you imagine everything's got to be carved backwards in order for it to be printed. So you're really making a mirror image. These are some of the earliest prints. Germany is known for those earliest forms, and a lot of them were illustrations about saints. This is Saint Sebastian being shot full of arrows. You'll see him a lot throughout art history, but all these illustrations started to come with the text. But you can see this earlier form before we had Gutenberg's movable type, where all that text had to be carved. So a little bit more tedious. Up here in the upper hand, right, you're seeing these tools. So here's the blades of the different cuts being used to create different types of lines. So we have right here, which can be, these are usually for engravings, but it'll allow for a really fine line. We have a V gouge, right, and that will remove a lot of material out of the way. A U gouge, right, even more wider. So you can look at this picture and kind of see, like, all right, I get each gouge is a different line, a little different line type, and these will come in a variety of sizes. So you can have a very, very small V gouge to something really wide. It takes several types of tools and sort of the pressure and understanding when you're cutting through the wood, how to control those lines to get the effects that you want. You don't want to make the same thin lines everywhere. What we notice about here, right, is the same type of line is everywhere. And so while you see the illustration, it doesn't come off as exciting, where if you add thick and then thin lines and such, it can make some really nice variety to the composition. Okay, so here's that same example of a woodcut, just to give you sort of a basis. This is some of the earliest, if not the earliest, woodcut that we know of. You can see that same sort of fine line where they're leaving just those little bits of material in there. We know that it can be a woodcut because we notice how it's a black line. Notice how the lines here are black in comparison to something like a wood engraving, where all of a sudden the lines are white. Okay, so what makes this different, even though it's still a relief process, when you're removing material with these type of tools, this material is done on the end grain of wood. So instead of using the plank, right, if you just went to the Home Depot and you bought a board and you cut it to the size that you want, you could just start drawing on it and then cutting it away, and it would look something more like this. Okay, and it's also what's in the illustration up above here. That's just regular flat-sided wood cut. But a wood engraving, what you do is you have to continue to prep the wood, and you're going to cut it into small pieces, and you're going to turn it on its side. All those little small pieces, turn them on the side, so that the grain that's really hard is sticking up, and you're going to glue that back together. It's basically like a cutting board. When you think of like a cutting board, has sometimes all that end grain turned up. And what that allows you to do is have finer lines. So you can look at this and you can see these really, really fine dots and lines and things like that, that when you look at this block, you don't have those fine of lines. Okay, and that's because we're using these tools, right? You can see how pointed that V gouge line is and that U gouge scorper is compared to the woodcut versions of those tools. Okay, so we get a completely different look, and wood engravings were very popular because they could hold up to the pressure of the press a whole lot more. You could probably print 100 to maybe 200, but probably just around 100 woodcuts, and all that wood would get softened on the edge. It's kind of getting hit each time, and so it gets softer and softer. Where a wood engraving, it's already really hard, and so it can print tens of thousands of prints before the block itself starts to get damaged. And that's why these became more popular for book illustrations. And so wood engraving really came around for illustrations in books and newspapers before more modern technology came about. Here's an example of that wood engraving in that process. And we can see the tool being held in the hand, and then that tool is then here in the hand here is being run across that block as the artist holds it. This is just a leather pad to sort of build up and allows them to turn. Okay, and that allows that to be carved. And then over here we see then the printing of it, okay, where they can take down, ink it up, put down the sheet of paper, and kind of go. So, and this is this is the wood engraving, and this is the woodcut version. So you can kind of see like how that differs. Here's that plank of wood, right? But here's that end grain, right? Really, it's usually smaller because it's longer to take. It's hard to make these blocks. But here you can really just get wicked with the tools. We see a variety of different tools used. So linoleum is the contemporary of a wood block. You can imagine if a piece of wood is not flat, or over time it could break, or when you're cutting into it, maybe splinter. Well, linoleum was one of the materials that actually came out of World War II. One of these things that was manufactured for flooring and coatings in battleships. And that leftover material, it's rolled out, as we all know, linoleum, but this stuff is just a little bit thicker and comes in rolls, and you can cut that to any size you want really easily, like cutting carpet. And with there, you already have a perfectly smooth surface. So you don't have to sand it. You don't have to worry about it warping. It's a very forgiving material because as you cut through it, you can make any sort of like curves and lines, and you don't have to worry about things breaking away from you. So it's really a whole lot easier to get these nice solid blacks because you know that that ink is going to be nice and smooth and even across the whole surface. So linoleum is really the contemporary, and people use it a whole lot more than woodcuts nowadays. All right, so those are all the relief processes. We're going to talk about intaglio. Intaglio is a funny word, but it encompasses quite a bit, and it differs from relief in the fact that now the areas that are cut out are going to be the areas that hold the ink. Before, when we cut out areas, that's all the raised surface was what held the ink. But now, as you can see, it's not the raised area, it's the inside of this line or these little, marks that's going to hold that ink. So this process has to have a printing press. The other one you could do by hand if you wanted. It could do a press too, but this process has to have a printing press. And what you're using is copper zinc metal plates, and you're either using a dry method or a wet method. The dry methods are dry point and mezzotint and engraving. We're going to talk about all those. And the chemical ones are using acid to eat away the surface. And so we get what's called an aquatint or an etching or a photogravure. And this stuff is going to really make it look like a pen and ink drawing, where the other ones may have been more about big blocky shapes. This is going to be really about line. Okay, so here's the process. Dry point, what that refers to is if you took a flat piece of copper, which you can see in the picture, and you just use a very hard pointed piece of metal to scrape into that copper. That copper is fairly soft, so you can use anything from like a steel nail that's maybe ground to a point. You can make some nice styluses. I've even seen like leather working needles used to cut into and to scrape into and to really draw. And you can see that drawing in that bottom left-hand picture sort of evolving, right? That is then inked, and that's what you see up here. So ink has been added to the plate up here, and you roll ink out over the entire surface, and you push it into those lines, and then you use a piece of cheesecloth and wipe it away. And when you wipe it away, that's why you can see the copper plate with those nice black lines still inside of it. So that's dry point. Now etching is maybe a more simple way of making a line because you're not physically having to gouge into the plate. And what you're using is sort of the same principle as like oil and water, or wax and water in this case. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your plate, and instead of drawing on it physically, you're going to coat it with a layer. Usually it's asphaltum, but it's going to be a coating of some sort that resists that acid touching the plate. So you're coating this plate, so therefore it's encased and nothing can harm it. And then you take that same sort of dry point needle or you can, they make different varieties, and you will then scrape away or draw into that asphaltum layer, and it'll very gently just remove that surface, exposing the plate. Okay, so now once I have all my lines drawn, I can put that into a bath container of acid, put the whole plate, submerge it in acid, leave it for a set amount of time. Sometimes it's 10 minutes, sometimes you etch even up to several hours. And when you pull it out, now the acid is able to touch the plate in those little fine line areas and eat away the surface, leaving a depression. Okay, and so that depression then can be filled in with ink and then printed. So, and then engraving, the last process, which we saw, is the same as wood engraving, but now you're just doing it on the copper surface, and you're running that gouge through there, just like you would a dry point needle in ways. But that's the way that these images are made. Okay, now the reason why we do them is that you can get more prints from them. They create a different line quality. As we look at these two examples here, one by Albrecht Dürer and Louise Bourgeois, we can see that sort of that pen and ink style. We can see that you can have a lot of expression in them. You can have a lot of control in it. It's sort of maybe what's considered more the finest of some of the print techniques. And even to this day, all of our money and a lot of currency around the world is still engraved by hand. The plates are engraved by hand and then printed, right? Because of that handmade quality that not only can be controlled and give us such a beautiful mark, but it also allows for the control of counterfeiting and such. So, even your money is a representation of these prints. Lithography, or also known as planographic processes. We'll talk about the two planographic ones, but lithography being the first, you really mean, stone writing, okay? And this uses oil and water and the idea that these stones, this very particular type of stone, it's Bavarian limestone, is cut and then ground and sanded flat on the surface. So you have this perfectly flat stone. It would almost look like a paver stone that you'd make a sidewalk from or something. But you have these stones, and from these stones, you are able to draw on the surface of them with, you can use just like a wax crayon, a grease pencil, something that will resist water. And so you draw all over this stone, and you can sort of see the image there, very similar. You still got to do things in reverse, but you now get to physically draw onto there. You're not going to cut away any of the surface. You're not removing any amount of stone or anything. You just let that grease pencil sit on the stone. You will then be able to coat the stone in water, and that water is going to be absorbed in the stone wherever there is no markings, right? The water is just going to sort of sit. It's going to be pushed away from this design. So everything else now is wet, and we use an oil-based ink. So when you roll across there, the oil ink can't stick to the wet areas, and that's going to be where the stone is still showing. But where the grease is, it can stick to that. So it'll just stick right to wherever you have drawn. And from there, now you can stick it in a printing press, which is a different style of printing press. But when it gets squeegeed through, then now you have your print. So lithography became really popular because it doesn't involve as much chemicals. It doesn't require a lot of manual labor, so you can really get in there, sort of express it. You can paint with this, with what's called touche and some other materials on it. You can create some really expressive stuff that doesn't require any gouging away the physical activity of it. So it's pretty popular. These stones, though, are very, very heavy and can be very big. They're also very expensive. They take their own type of printing press. So there's a downside to it because of the cost and the studio space needed to run it. So a lot of artists would get together and have co-ops in order to find and use facilities like this. Today, the process has been duplicated onto plastic plates and thin metal plates, but This process itself is still being used in many capacities to print like newspapers and magazines and such, and offset lithography and such to add more color. So it's still around, it's still being used. It's just not the stone as much anymore. But your art institutions will still carry the stones. Right, and here's an example of how big some of those stones can be. And in the upper left, you see the artist rolling across that stone, and you notice how clean it still looks, even though he's rolling across it. And down below, we see the image, one of the images, and over here, the print is being pulled. And so it just came right through the press. The press here, what it acts like is like a squeegee bar. So when you pull this lever down on the stone, it clamps it really tight, and then you'll crank it through, and that squeegee is just sliding across the surface until it gets to a point right around here. Then you'll stop, unclamp it, and then lift your print, and do it again and again and again. Here's some examples of the lithography. Lithography does look more like a drawing. It can carry those sort of textures. It can look like a charcoal drawing. It has a completely different feel about it than the other. All right, silkscreen is also a planographic technique because we're talking about just flat planes. And I give you sort of the breakdown. Silkscreen is very, very popular. You can do this at home with homemade kits, very inexpensive. You can do it at any level because the idea is that if you have a screen, which is a frame with a piece of silk stretched over it really tight, you can cut a stencil, you can use photosensitive materials to make an image, whatever you want, and you're just blocking out places where the ink can go and cannot go. So if we cut this, like they show the letter Z, and we adhered that stencil to here, only where it's cut out can ink be forced through. So once we put our paper down, you throw in some ink, and you take a squeegee and you scrape it across that surface, and only where it's cut away, yeah, makes sense, it'll come right through. But if you want to check out the YouTube video, there's some really cool silkscreen techniques on there. Here's that printing process being used for textiles, and you can see that squeegee. They're made in all different sizes, and just pulling that color across. Everything here is blocked out, right? This is technically the stencil right in here, and somewhere in here is going to be an image. All right. Silk screens, you can see the background of this piece still has sort of like a mixture effect. It's what's called like a rainbow roll in many regards, or a blend, and you can load 2 inks or 3 inks at the same time and squeegee them naturally together. But you can see those really sharp lines. It's very graphic, and silkscreen is still some of the main graphic departments will teach silkscreen as a part of their sort of mediums, because it traditionally was used in advertising quite a bit. Now we still use it for a lot for t-shirts. Inkjet, the most modern, is the idea of letting the printer and types of printers that have the ink built into a cartridge, right, print out that image for you. So I love showing this piece because we've been able to challenge the boundaries. Instead of just having just paper run through it, we can print on a variety of substrates, and this is printed on confetti. And so we have this skull image, and it'll be there in your book if you want to read more about it. But the idea that this was printed on a inkjet printer, right, and pretty amazing to think of that process. All right, moving on to chapter 9. Sometimes lumped in with printmaking is photography and digital art. We'll talk a lot about photography, and digital art kind of goes quick, so bear with me. And photography we've actually known about for a long time in our lives. We realized, as the image illustrates, that when light is passed through a small opening, right, that's basically like allowing a light to focus. And if you happen to be standing in a dark room, right, it'll project that. We understand the principles of photography. It just took a while to build the tech and the chemicals and stuff to be able to control it and capture and contain it. Right, but artists have been relying on this skill, or what's also known as a camera obscura, since the 1600s. And photography will become sort of an interesting, we'll even call it a necessary evil for artists, where most artists had spent their entire lives trying to depict nature as accurately as possible. But once photography comes around and you're actually able to take a photo, well, then why spend all that time drawing it or painting it, right? If the idea is to get at the best representation of the image, especially as quick as possible, why not just take photos? So there's that, but it opened up the doors for expression, because now instead of having to worry about painting realistically, we can just paint what we want or do what we want. So the camera obscura, here's another sort of example of it. The idea is that you can see here it's a large box. There's other variations like that Vermeer would use, where it's more of like a tabletop version and you can look down in it, almost like how a periscope is set up. But the idea is that if you had the sitter outside of the box, right, and where the light source is behind them, or natural light's behind them, and then that small little opening on the side here, that little it'll almost be like a pinhole size, will then project, and the artist could then trace onto a surface that's mounted there. So when you think of that, you think, well, isn't that cheating? Yes and no. I mean, they still have to, eventually go back and paint it, but to get the sketching and the proportions and everything right, this was the easiest way to do it. And a lot of artists utilize setups like this. Now, the real first photo, though, that we have by Joseph Nies it took him 8 hours to get this. And what you're seeing here is a view out of his window, and there's really not a whole lot to look at. We can see some architectural forms, the rooftop or pillar and things like that, but there's not a whole lot there. So to realize that it took the chemicals that he's using 8 hours just to get this much, and not a whole lot of clarity, it makes you think like a charcoal drawing. You realize there's a lot of refinement that needs to happen. Okay, well, Nies ends up teaming up with a guy named Daguerre, and here's what will eventually become known as the daguerreotype, right? The first cameras that allow for this to happen. They worked together for quite a long time, but then Nies dies, and Daguerre just kind of gets to assume all of that research. And what he does is he puts together all that science to eventually get to something like this. Now we're looking out of a building again. Well, what do you really notice? I'm going to give you just a few seconds to sort of look at this street scene. And you think of the obvious. You look out and you see the buildings and you see the trees and everything seems to be in place. However, if this is a boulevard, where are all the people? Well, we see one right here, right? It almost looks like a statue in some regards, but there's nobody else. There's nothing else going on, right? And it's not because there's a pandemic or anything going on, but what it does is this still takes a while to expose. And the only two people that were standing still long enough were a man stopping to get his shoes shined right here. And so they get captured, where everybody else is just moving too fast for that to happen. So the process still evolving, but it allows us to get a really good sense of place and clarity. We can see details starting to form. And these are the first daguerreotypes, usually done on glass plates. Eventually there will be like tin types that are done on tin plates and such, where that photographic chemical is put onto the glass. When exposed to light, it's captured, and that glass then is used as the negative to then be re-exposed to light and onto paper. So that makes any sense. All right. The camera itself goes through a lot of evolution, a lot of upgrades. People get their own sizes and styles and stuff until it becomes something that's a little bit more portable. Portable cameras really become necessary and during the Great Depression. And artists, especially photographers, were commissioned by the government in what's known as the Works Project Administration, or WPA. There's also several other government organizations set up to pay to get people back to work, and they're paying artists to go around and photograph the American landscape, sending them around to say, well, what do we look like, what's going on? And the most famous of these images is by Dorothea Lange, where she goes into a migrant camp. If you've ever read like The Grapes of Wrath or East of Eden by Steinbeck, right? We know that we have all the quote unquote Okies, right, coming into California trying to find work and stuff and living in these camps along the way. And here a woman was captured, with her hungry children all around her and no work, and you're just kind of there, right? And these images allowed us to see all that was going on in the United States, and they really spread and started causing change. So besides just the everyday life, though, artists began to also experiment with it. Man Ray was a part of the Dada and Surrealists, and he would use his photographic paper as sort of what's called photograms. And this is just sort of drawing with light using ready-made objects, putting them down onto the surface of the paper, exposing them to light, and then that's it. So we see the obvious comb here and what may be like a butter knife next to it. But all of this is sort of drawn and blocked out with just objects on paper, on that photographic paper. So he's not using a camera, he's just using light and light-sensitive paper. One of the interesting things is, as people begin to realize, well, if you can capture, one thing still, can we eventually get enough pictures together to make it look like it's moving? And this really all started with a bet, and Muybridge was basically commissioned by two guys trying to settle a bet, which was that one believed that a horse never had all of its feet off the ground in full gallop, and there would always at least be a minimum of one. The other one said no, they have to be at least off. Well, so what Muybridge did is he set up his cameras, several cameras with tripwires, and as the horse raced through and hit those tripwires, right, a photo was able to be captured. So it took a little bit of technological advancements to be able to get that instant photo. Right, it didn't have to be posed or sitting still, but as you can see, the bet was settled, and sure enough, the horse at a couple points does have all of its legs off the ground. So I'm sure one guy went away happy and one guy went away sad. But what it realized is that, oh wow, we may be able to make sort of moving pictures, and thus the experimentation and the camera changes again, and we get director artists like George Méliès, which there is a link to on Canopy for some films I want you to watch. And you may have seen this one or have seen this sort of logo before, but Méliès is doing his work way before we had any special effects. So a lot of these films were done on a stage using props. It almost, when you watch it, will remind you of like a kindergarten sort of like Christmas pageant, that we used to always have to participate in. And because of this, he was able to figure out, well, I can stop the film, or I can overlay film, I can put all, and he really starts experimenting a lot with the film itself. So take a look at this, because if it wasn't for Méliès, then we wouldn't have the idea of storytelling. Now, of course, all these things are silent and would require an organ to play along with them. So the links that I have for you on Canopy are these revised films of some that are left. They're really, it's not that they're great films, they're historically interesting, they're funny, but they are very sort of like sexist, racist in ways, just because of like the roles and the way they tell roles are stories based off of stereotypes. So I'm not proclaiming them in that way, but definitely check them out as sort of like as a historical marker. As technology continues to increase, artists realize that, yeah, we can use this specifically as a medium. And Namjoon Paik, he's from South Korea, and starts using pretty much all of our popular technology, and was actually the first artist to figure out how to, he worked with an engineer, figure out how to take several cameras and hook them up to one monitor, and so imagine like playing 6 DVDs through one monitor at one time, right? And being able to see all the images. And he was able to have like this tuner that allowed him to sort of like blend and make sort of these collages. So it's like a moving video collage. So he did a lot of like technology, but not just like just setting it up, but really manipulating it to create new images. The internet, of course, is now sort of one of our newest ways of not just serving the web for art, but using the internet. And this is an older example, of course, of Second Life, but we can think of like how online gaming and using the internet has changed how we interact with one another and how we see the world and how we can alter the world or create different realities of ourselves. And that's what this artist is doing, is had created, a whole other life for herself, really. And because of technology, it's now come back out of just being in the technological world. And I'd love just to show this one to say, yeah, we understand these now as signs and symbols that are in our everyday life. It's very easy to say, oh, that's a Google marker, right? And so the artist is making it very aware that because of technology and how we use technology to interact with the world, right, this is what we're looking for, right? We all want to go to these destination places that if it wasn't for Google Maps, we may never find, or may have never even known about them. So, is it, and so now just placing a marker here, it makes us feel like, oh, this must be of some importance because this marker tells me so. So you kind of have to think of the symbolic nature of it. But that's these two chapters. We're going to continue talking about graphic design and stuff in the next one.